The crowd falls silent as 6-year-old Zuri Williams stands alone before the city council, her small shoulders straight despite the whispers. Billionaire Richard Hayes sits motionless in his custom wheelchair, watching her with unreadable eyes. Nobody knows the truth about what happened in Pinecrest Alley that night, except these two unlikely allies about to change everything. Before we dive into this incredible story, tell us where you're watching from today. Hit that like button and subscribe right now if you've ever witnessed an unexpected moment that completely changed someone's life. How would you react if a complete stranger saved you from danger? Let's find out what happens when worlds collide in ways nobody could have predicted. Richard Hayes, tech billionaire and CEO of Nexus Innovations, found himself lost in the predominantly black neighborhood of Riverside. His sleek midnight blue Bentley had taken a wrong turn after a particularly contentious community meeting where Hayes had presented his vision for revitalizing the area. The 45-year-old executive was known for his cutthroat business tactics and controversial urban development projects that had transformed countless neighborhoods across America. Impatient and unwilling to wait for his security team to navigate the unfamiliar streets, Hayes instructed his driver to stop, deciding he would walk the remaining 6 blocks to his hotel. The evening air felt unusually thick with tension as Hayes stepped out of the vehicle, his tailored suit and platinum watch immediately marking him as an outsider in this working-class community. The council vote scheduled for tomorrow would determine whether his company could proceed with plans to redevelop Riverside into luxury apartments and high-end retail spaces, effectively displacing hundreds of families who had called this neighborhood home for generations. Hayes checked his phone's map and identified a shortcut through Pinecrest Alley, a narrow passage between 2 rows of brick buildings adorned with vibrant murals depicting the neighborhood's history. He dismissed his driver with a wave, confident in his decision to walk alone despite the growing darkness. Not far from where Hayes began his journey, 6-year-old Zuri Williams practiced her baseball throws against a painted target on the brick wall of her apartment building. The community garden adjacent to Pinecrest Alley had become her regular training ground since the local youth sports program lost its funding. Zuri's remarkable accuracy with a baseball had become something of a neighborhood legend, her small frame belying the power and precision of her throws. Her single mother, Keisha, worked night shifts as a nurse at Mercy Hospital, leaving Zuri in the care of their elderly neighbor, Mrs. Jenkins, who had dozed off in her chair on the nearby porch. The baseball had been a gift from Zuri's father before he was wrongfully imprisoned 3 years earlier, another victim of a justice system that seemed designed to separate black families rather than protect them. With each throw, Zuri imagined her father watching his proud smile, giving her strength to continue practicing despite the dilapidated facilities and constant reminders that girls, especially black girls, weren't supposed to excel at baseball. As dusk settled over Riverside, Zuri's ball bounced off the wall at an odd angle, rolling into Pinecrest Alley. Following her beloved baseball, she stepped into the shadowy passage, the sounds of the neighborhood fading behind her. The moment she retrieved her ball, she froze at the sound of footsteps echoing through the alley. 3 men approached Richard Hayes from the opposite end, their movements deliberate and predatory. Zuri instinctively shrank back against the wall, clutching her baseball tightly as she watched the scene unfold. The leader of the 3 men stepped forward, his face partially illuminated by the dim light filtering through the alley. "Mr. Hayes," he said, his voice carrying an artificial pleasantness that made Zuri shiver. "Fancy meeting you here all alone." Hayes straightened his posture, instantly alert to the danger, but maintaining the confident demeanor that had served him through countless business confrontations. "I don't believe we've been introduced," he replied coolly, assessing his options as the men spread out to block any escape route. "Victor Reynolds," the man said with a slight bow that mocked rather than respected. "Real estate investor. I have some stakeholders very interested in ensuring tomorrow's vote doesn't go your way." Hayes recognized the name immediately. Victor Reynolds had connections to several of his business rivals and was rumored to have ties to less legitimate enterprises. This wasn't a random mugging. It was a calculated elimination of competition before the crucial vote. The 2 men flanking Reynolds moved with practiced coordination, one pulling out a knife while the other reached inside his jacket. Hayes backed up until he felt brick against his spine, calculating that his wealth would be useless if these men intended more than simple robbery. From her hiding place, Zuri watched in terror as the situation escalated. The men weren't just trying to scare the suited stranger. She recognized the same look in their eyes that she'd seen in the courtroom when the judge sentenced her father despite all evidence pointing to his innocence. These men intended to permanently remove Hayes from tomorrow's vote. In that moment, without fully understanding the political and business machinations at play, Zuri made a decision that would alter countless lives, including her own. With the precision that came from thousands of hours of practice, she gripped the baseball, drew her arm back, and released it with all her might. The ball flew true, striking the knife-wielding attacker directly at the base of his skull with a sickening thud. The man crumpled immediately, his weapon clattering to the ground. The sudden attack from an unseen defender created momentary confusion, giving Hayes the opportunity to drive his fist into Reynolds' stomach, doubling the man over. The third attacker, startled by the unexpected resistance, fired a shot that went wide, the sound echoing deafeningly in the confined space of the alley. Zuri emerged from the shadows, her small frame darting forward to retrieve her baseball in a fluid motion before launching it again, this time striking the armed man's wrist with precision that would have impressed Major League scouts. The gun dropped as the man howled in pain, clutching his potentially fractured bones. Reynolds, recovering from Hayes's blow, assessed the chaotic situation and made a tactical decision. "This isn't over," he snarled, pulling his injured associates away as they retreated down the alley. For a moment, the only sounds were the fading footsteps of the attackers and the labored breathing of the billionaire, who had just narrowly escaped a deadly ambush. Hayes turned toward his unexpected savior, making eye contact with Zuri across the distance that separated them, a distance that represented far more than just physical space. In that silent exchange, something profound and unexpected passed between the powerful white businessman and the young black girl from the neighborhood he planned to demolish. Neither could possibly comprehend how this chance encounter would transform both their lives and challenge the very foundations of power, privilege, and community in ways that would ripple far beyond Riverside. Hours after the attack, Richard Hayes sat rigidly on the edge of his king-sized bed in the presidential suite of the Grand Meridian Hotel, wincing as he pressed an ice pack to his bruised ribs. The panoramic windows offered a spectacular nighttime view of the city lights twinkling like earthbound stars, but Hayes stared unseeing at his own reflection in the glass. Carolyn Chen, his executive assistant of 8 years, paced the room with controlled anxiety, her usually impeccable composure frayed at the edges. "Richard, I've called Dr. Winters 3 times. He can be here in 20 minutes, no questions asked. And Detective Sanderson is still waiting for your statement about the attack." Hayes waved away her concerns with his free hand, the movement causing another stab of pain across his torso. "No doctors, no police. This stays private, Caroline." He finally turned to face her, his expression hardening. "I recognized Reynolds. This wasn't random." Caroline stopped pacing her analytical mind, immediately processing the implications. Victor Reynolds was a known entity in their world, a middleman who operated in the gray areas between legitimate business and organized crime. If Reynolds was involved, someone powerful wanted Hayes neutralized before tomorrow's vote. "We should postpone the council meeting," she suggested already, mentally drafting the press release. "Cite unexpected complications with the environmental impact assessment." Hayes nodded slowly, his mind elsewhere. The image of the young girl kept resurfacing, her determined expression as she launched that baseball with unerring accuracy, saving him from what would certainly have been a deadly encounter. A child from Riverside, the very neighborhood he planned to transform into luxury condominiums that would price out every current resident. Make the call, he agreed, an unusual hesitation in his voice. "And Caroline, I need you to find someone for me. A young black girl, about 6 years old, lives somewhere near Pinecrest Alley. She has," he paused, searching for the right words, "remarkable baseball skills." Caroline's eyebrows rose slightly, but she asked no questions, making a note in her ever-present tablet. "Consider it done," she responded, stepping into the adjacent room to begin making arrangements. Across town, in a small two-bedroom apartment with peeling paint and mismatched furniture that somehow created a warm, inviting atmosphere, Zuri Williams lay wide awake in her bed, adorned with second-hand baseball-themed sheets. The events in the alley played on repeat in her mind. The glint of the knife, the sound of the gunshot, the feel of the baseball leaving her fingertips with perfect spin. She had retrieved her ball and run straight home after the men fled, saying nothing to Mrs. Jenkins about what had transpired. The elderly woman had awakened from her nap flustered to find she'd dozed off while watching Zuri, but relieved to see the child safely returned. Now as midnight approached, Zuri heard the familiar sound of the front door opening as her mother Keisha returned from her 12-hour hospital shift. Keisha Williams moved quietly through their apartment, checking first on her daughter as she did every night. Finding Zuri's eyes open and alert, she sat on the edge of the bed, her medical scrub still bearing the faint, antiseptic smell of Mercy Hospital. "Can't sleep, sunshine?" she asked, her voice gentle despite the exhaustion etched into her face. Zuri shook her head, wanting desperately to share what had happened, but afraid of her mother's reaction. Keisha misinterpreted her daughter's restlessness, assuming it was anxiety about their uncertain future. "I know you're worried about the vote tomorrow," she said, smoothing Zuri's tightly coiled hair. "But whatever happens with Mr. Hayes and his fancy buildings, we'll figure it out together. We always do." Zuri nodded, allowing her mother to believe this explanation for her sleeplessness. Keisha kissed her forehead before heading to the shower, her shoulders dropping with fatigue as soon as she turned away. The following morning brought unexpected news that rippled through Riverside. Richard Hayes had postponed the council vote indefinitely, citing new considerations that require thorough examination. The community center buzzed with speculation as residents who had planned protest signs and prepared impassioned speeches suddenly found themselves in an unexpected limbo. At Riverside Elementary, Zuri moved through her day in a fog, the teacher's voice fading in and out of her awareness as she replayed the alley incident. During recess, a group of boys monopolized the playing field, as they always did, leaving Zuri to practice her throws against the brick wall alone. "Baseball is for boys," taunted Marcus Johnson, an 8-year-old who appointed himself gatekeeper of who could play which sports. "Girls are supposed to play with dolls and stuff." The other boys laughed, emboldened by their leader's mockery. Zuri ignored them with practiced indifference, focusing instead on the satisfying smack of the ball against her palm as it returned from the wall. Mr. Washington, her observant second-grade teacher, noticed her unusual quietness during their afternoon math lesson. As the students filed out at the end of the day, he asked Zuri to stay behind for a moment. "Is everything okay, Zuri? You seem distracted today." His kind eyes conveyed genuine concern that nearly broke through her composure. "I'm fine, Mr. Washington," she replied, automatically avoiding his gaze. "Just thinking about baseball stuff." The teacher nodded, not entirely convinced, but respecting her privacy. "Well, if you ever need to talk about baseball stuff or anything else, my door is always open." He gave her an encouraging smile as she left, watching her small figure with the ever-present baseball clutched tightly in her hand. Meanwhile, Richard Hayes directed his private security team to locate the girl who had saved him, providing them with the minimal description he had a young black girl with exceptional aim and a well-worn baseball. The instructions led to an uncomfortable scene as men in expensive suits began questioning Riverside residents about a small black girl with a baseball. Their presence immediately perceived as threatening in a community already anxious about displacement. Parents pulled children closer as the men approached years of experience, teaching them to be wary of outsiders, asking about their children. Community leaders began tracking the movements of Hayes' security team, assuming they were mapping buildings for demolition or gathering intelligence to counter the planned protests. The mistrust that had festered for generations between wealthy white businessmen and historically black neighborhoods created a barrier of suspicion that Hayes' team could not penetrate. Frustrated by the lack of progress and unwilling to explain to his security chief why finding this child had become so important, Hayes made an unprecedented decision. Late that afternoon, he dismissed his driver and security detail, taking the wheel of a modest sedan from his company's fleet, the kind of vehicle that wouldn't immediately announce his wealth and status. He drove slowly through Riverside, absorbing details of the neighborhood he had previously viewed only through economic spreadsheets and development potential. Children played in makeshift playgrounds created from discarded tires and salvaged materials. Elders sat on porches, keeping watchful eyes on the community's young ones. Murals depicting civil rights leaders and local heroes adorned buildings scheduled for demolition under his original plan. As dusk approached, Hayes turned down a side street and immediately slowed the car. There, throwing a baseball against a wall covered with posters announcing "Save Riverside and Communities Over Corporations," was the girl from the alley. Her form was perfect, her follow-through demonstrating an innate understanding of body mechanics that most adult athletes spent years trying to master. Hayes pulled the car to the curb and watched silently, feeling an unexpected connection to his own long-abandoned childhood dreams before wealth and power had reshaped his identity and purpose. The moment crystallized something he had been unable to articulate since the attack. This child had not only saved his life, she had inadvertently forced him to see Riverside as more than a business opportunity. She had made him remember what it felt like to be small and determined in a world designed for others to succeed. Richard Hayes stepped out of his nondescript sedan, his designer shoes scuffing against the cracked sidewalk as he approached Zuri at the wall. His unexpected presence created an immediate ripple effect throughout the nearby houses, as though the community possessed a collective sixth sense for detecting outsiders. Zuri froze mid-throw, the baseball clutched tightly in her small hand as she recognized the man from the alley. Before either could speak, Mrs. Jenkins emerged from her porch with remarkable speed for her 73 years, positioning herself protectively between Zuri and the billionaire while simultaneously dialing Keisha's number on her ancient flip phone. "Can I help you, sir?" Mrs. Jenkins asked, her polite tone belied by the steel in her eyes that had witnessed 6 decades of white men entering black neighborhoods with promises that turned to displacement. Hayes cleared his throat awkwardly, the practiced charisma that commanded boardrooms deserting him under the elderly woman's scrutinizing gaze. "I wanted to thank her," he explained, gesturing toward Zuri, who remained uncharacteristically silent. "For yesterday, in the alley." Mrs. Jenkins maintained her protective stance, comprehension dawning in her expression as she connected this unexpected visitor to Zuri's unusual behavior since the previous evening. Through the phone, she rapidly explained the situation to Keisha, who immediately requested an emergency release from her shift. Within 12 minutes, Zuri counted each passing second. Her mother's faded blue Honda screeched to a halt beside Hayes's sedan, and Keisha Williams emerged, still wearing her hospital scrubs, her face a mixture of concern and suspicion. "Mr. Hayes," she stated, rather than asked, recognizing the billionaire from newspaper photographs and community meetings. "What exactly is your business with my daughter?" Hayes straightened his posture, attempting to regain his usual commanding presence. "Your daughter displayed remarkable courage yesterday evening. She intervened in a situation that could have ended." He paused, glancing at Zuri, before choosing his words carefully. "Very differently for me. I wanted to express my gratitude." He reached into his jacket, extracting a checkbook. "I'd like to offer compensation that could help with her education, perhaps sports training." Keisha's expression hardened, her chin lifting as she cut him off with a raised hand. "We don't need your money, Mr. Hayes. What we need is our home, our community, which your company plans to bulldoze for luxury condos nobody here could ever afford." Her voice remained measured, but carried an unmistakable intensity that drew neighbors from their homes, the confrontation between the nurse and the billionaire becoming impromptu street theater. Hayes found himself uncharacteristically defensive as he responded, "The Riverside Development Project isn't about destroying the community, it's about revitalization." "The current infrastructure is revitalization," Keisha interrupted the word sharp with derision. "Is that what you call pricing out families who've lived here for generations, creating glossy brochures that conveniently erase us from our own neighborhood?" She gestured broadly at the surrounding buildings. "This isn't just housing, Mr. Hayes. These walls hold our history. That community center you plan to replace with a boutique hotel. That's where we hold our family reunions, where our children learn their heritage, where we gather during crises." The gathering crowd murmured in agreement, some residents pulling out phones to record the confrontation. Hayes shifted uncomfortably, acutely aware of being surrounded by the very people his project would displace. Their faces were no longer the anonymous statistics from his presentation slides, but individuals with lives and histories inextricably connected to this land. Zuri stepped forward, suddenly her voice small but clear as she addressed the billionaire. "You didn't say thank you to me in the alley." The simple observation created a momentary silence, the child's perspective cutting through the tension. Hayes looked directly at her, something softening in his expression. "You're right, I didn't. Everything happened so quickly." He knelt to her eye level, ignoring the damage to his bespoke suit from the dusty sidewalk. "Thank you for your help. You have an extraordinary talent." Meanwhile, across town, in a private medical facility that catered exclusively to wealthy clients, Victor Reynolds received treatment for the bruised ribs and wounded pride inflicted by Hayes and his unexpected young defender. His phone buzzed incessantly with messages from his employers demanding updates on the situation. Reynolds's carefully cultivated reputation for handling delicate problems efficiently had suffered a significant blow. When an associate showed him social media footage of Hayes in Riverside, apparently seeking out the child who had interfered, Reynolds felt a surge of opportunity through his pain. He dispatched 2 men to observe both Hayes and identify the girl. Their instructions: clear, gather information only, no engagement. Back at Nexus Innovations headquarters, the postponement of the council vote created ripples of concern among board members. Marjorie Winters, the sharp-tongued CFO who had helped build the company from its early days, cornered Caroline in the executive hallway. "What's going on with Richard? First he misses the strategic planning meeting. Then he postpones the vote we've spent months preparing for. And now I hear he's wandering around Riverside without security." Caroline maintained her professional composure while carefully selecting what information to share. "Mr. Souse, End, RF. Hayes is reassessing certain aspects of the development plan. He believes there may be approaches that would better serve both the company's interests and address community concerns." Marjorie's eyes narrowed skeptically. "This wouldn't have anything to do with that incident. His security team is being so tight-lipped about, would it?" Caroline deflected with practiced ease, but the conversation left her troubled. In his private office, Hayes immersed himself in research about Riverside's history. Information he should have reviewed thoroughly before developing his plans, but had delegated to subordinates focused solely on profit potential. The neighborhood had been established by freed slaves in the late 1862, growing into a thriving community despite decades of discriminatory housing policies and systematic disinvestment. Hayes found himself lingering over historical photographs of the community baseball field that would be demolished under his current plans. A field where generations of children had played, including several who went on to professional careers. Do you believe Richard Hayes deserves a chance at redemption? Or is his sudden interest in Riverside just a calculated business move? Comment number 1. If you think people can truly change when confronted with the human cost of their actions, or comment number 2, if you believe billionaires only care about their bottom line. Like this video if you've ever witnessed someone standing up for their community against powerful outside interests, and subscribe to hear the next part of this incredible story. What happens when Hayes starts experiencing flashbacks to his own childhood poverty? Will Keisha allow her daughter to associate with the very man threatening their home? And what dangerous plans is Victor Reynolds developing in the shadows? Is this unexpected connection between a billionaire and a young girl enough to save an entire community? 2 weeks after the confrontation in Pinecrest Alley, Zuri Williams stood on a recently resurfaced basketball court that had been converted into a makeshift baseball training area. Her face furrowed in concentration as she listened to Coach Juan Marcus Jefferson demonstrate proper wrist position for various pitches. The former minor league player had mysteriously appeared at Riverside Elementary, offering free baseball coaching to talented young athletes, though everyone in the community understood he had been hired specifically for Zuri. Keisha Williams watched from a bench at the edge of the court, her arms crossed protectively across her chest, as she observed her daughter blossoming under professional instruction while simultaneously worrying about the strings attached to this unexpected opportunity. Jefferson had been vague about who had hired him, mentioning only a foundation interested in developing diverse talent, but Keisha recognized Richard Hayes's midnight blue sedan parked discreetly across the street 3 days a week during Zuri's training sessions. The billionaire never approached them directly, observing from a distance, with an expression Keisha couldn't quite decipher, something between curiosity and a deeper emotion she hesitated to name. While Zuri practiced increasingly complex throwing techniques, Richard Hayes sat behind the wheel of his car window, rolled down to catch fragments of the coach's instructions carried on the breeze. He found himself inexplicably drawn to these sessions, fascinated by the child's natural talent and her fierce determination to master each new skill. Caroline had arranged the coaching through a series of intermediaries to maintain Hayes's anonymity, though the community's grapevine quickly surmised the truth. Hayes had attempted to explain his growing interest in the girl to himself in rational terms. She had saved his life, he owed her a debt, supporting her talent was simple reciprocity, but the reality was more complex and uncomfortable to acknowledge. Something about Zuri's dedication to baseball, despite every societal obstacle, resonated with memories he had suppressed for decades, himself at 8 years old, throwing a ball against the side of their trailer while his mother worked double shifts, the baseball scholarship he'd abandoned for the more practical computer science degree that launched his fortune, the person he might have become if different choices had been made. Victor Reynolds, meanwhile, had transformed his humiliation into calculated planning. His surveillance revealed the growing connection between Hayes and the Williams family, a vulnerability he intended to exploit. On a rainy Tuesday night, while Keisha worked her hospital shift and Mrs. Jenkins dozed in front of her television, 2 men in dark clothing approached the Williams apartment building. Their vandalism was specific and targeted, spray-painted threats across the door, reading "Traitors die" and "Sellouts. Get what they deserve." The messages clearly referencing the community's suspicion about Zuri's new coaching arrangement. When Hayes learned of the incident through his security team's report, something primitive and protective awakened within him. Without consulting his legal department or considering the potential public relations implications, he contacted Keisha directly, insisting that she and Zuri temporarily relocate to a secure apartment owned by Nexus Innovations in the Eniet Sayens downtown district. "These people are dangerous, Miss Williams," he explained, his voice tense through the phone connection. The messages weren't random vandalism. They were warnings. Reynolds won't hesitate to use a child to get what he wants. Keisha's initial refusal stemmed from both practical independence and deeper principle, accepting. Hayes's protection felt like betraying her community, especially as many neighbors now regarded her family with suspicion, whispering about special treatment and selling out. The internal conflict tore at her, maternal protection warring with community loyalty and personal pride. When a brick shattered their living room window the following night, narrowly missing Zuri, as she practiced her pitching form, Keisha reluctantly accepted Hayes's offer. The temporary relocation to a luxury apartment created ripples through Riverside, with rumors spreading that Hayes was buying off vocal opposition to his development. Community organizers who had once welcomed Keisha's passionate advocacy at planning meetings now avoided eye contact when paths crossed. The elegant, high-rise apartment felt simultaneously like sanctuary and betrayal as Zuri explored its spacious rooms with wide-eyed curiosity, while Keisha stared out floor-to-ceiling windows at a city view that intentionally excluded their neighborhood from its panorama. On their third evening in the apartment, Zuri discovered a glass display case in Hayes's home office, containing a collection of carefully preserved baseballs, each mounted on a wooden stand with small brass plaques noting dates and signatures. "Mom, look," she called out, excitedly, pressing her nose against the glass. "Mr. Hayes likes baseball too." The discovery prompted an unexpected visit from Hayes himself, ostensibly to check on their comfort, but clearly drawn by the opportunity to share his long-dormant passion. As Keisha prepared dinner in the gourmet kitchen, she was still learning to navigate. Hayes sat with Zuri in the living room, each baseball removed from its case, becoming a tangible connection to a part of himself he had buried beneath. Balance sheets and acquisition strategies. This one, he explained, handling a scuffed ball with visible stitching wear, was the last home run I hit in high school. Bottom of the ninth, bases loaded. We were down by 3 runs in the state championship. Zuri held the ball reverently, her fingers tracing the same paths as teenage Richards had decades earlier. "Did you win?" she asked, her voice hushed with anticipation. Hayes nodded a smile, transforming his usually serious features, by 1 run. "I thought I'd play professionally someday." The conversation flowed more naturally than either adult expected, as Hayes revealed his childhood in a mobile home park in rural Pennsylvania, raised by a single mother who worked cleaning hotels and offices. Keisha found herself sharing parallel experiences, the struggles of single parenthood, dreams deferred by economic necessity, the determination to give her child opportunities she never had. The unexpected common ground created a fragile bridge across the vast differences in their current circumstances. The tentative connection fractured the following morning, when Keisha discovered architectural plans left carelessly on Hayes's desk during a corporate visit. The modified Riverside development still included substantial demolition and displacement, though now with token preservation of certain historically significant buildings. Keisha confronted Hayes when he arrived that evening, her voice tight with betrayal. "So this is your solution. Keep a few buildings as museum pieces while you price out the actual community who gives them meaning. Was getting close to Zuri just your way of softening opposition?" Hayes's defense came reflexively corporate, language providing familiar shelter. "The modifications represent significant concessions, Miss Williams. We've preserved the community center, redesigned the housing mix to include 30% affordable units, affordable by whose standards?" Keisha interrupted, holding up the income qualification requirements highlighted in the present document. "Not anyone currently living in Riverside. This isn't compromise, it's gentrification with better public relations." The tension between them remained unresolved, as Hayes departed for a hastily arranged community meeting at Riverside's Macedonia Baptist Church. The historic building overflowed with residents demanding explanation for the postponed vote and circulating rumors about modified plans. Hayes stood before the hostile crowd, his usual confident presentation style failing him as he attempted to explain his evolving vision for the neighborhood's future. From the back of the church, Reynolds's associates circulated quietly whispering inflammatory suggestions to key community members, deliberately escalating racial tensions with comments about white saviors and selling our heritage. The meeting deteriorated rapidly, angry voices overlapping as decades of justifiable mistrust erupted. When a physical confrontation seemed imminent, Zuri's small voice somehow cut through the chaos. She had insisted on attending despite Keisha's reluctance, slipping away from her mother's side to stand in the center aisle. "He's not as bad as you think," she stated simply, her unexpected defense creating a moment of stunned silence throughout the church. Every eye turned toward the small defender, her baseball clutched tightly in her hand like a talisman. The tableau, a young black girl defending a white billionaire before her own skeptical community, captured the complex intersection of race power and unexpected human connection at the heart of Riverside's uncertain future. The fallout from the community meeting reverberated through both Riverside and the corporate offices of Nexus Innovations. Richard Hayes faced unprecedented pushback from his board of directors, particularly from James Huntington, the silver-haired venture capitalist who had provided critical early funding for the company. Huntington cornered Hayes in the executive conference room after most members had departed, his patrician features arranged in an expression of concerned disappointment that barely masked his irritation. "Richard, we've supported your leadership through some unconventional decisions over the years, but this wavering on Riverside is becoming problematic for our investors. The quarterly projections were built on breaking ground next month. These delays and mysterious modifications you're proposing threaten the entire fiscal year strategy." Hayes maintained his composure, though the muscle tightening in his jaw betrayed his tension. "The situation is more complex than originally assessed, James. There are historical and community factors that deserve more thorough consideration. Huntington's laugh held no humor. Since when does Richard Hayes, the man who revolutionized hostile takeovers, concern himself with community factors? This neighborhood sits on prime real estate that's been undervalued for decades. Our investors expect us to capitalize on that opportunity, not get sidetracked by sentimentality. The conversation ended in a stalemate, with Hayes uncharacteristically refusing to provide concrete timelines for moving forward with development. As Huntington departed, Caroline Chen entered with a tablet displaying information that made Hayes's blood run cold. Financial records showing substantial payments from Huntington's private investment fund to shell companies, connected to Victor Reynolds. The attack in Pinecrest Alley suddenly made horrifying sense. It hadn't been orchestrated by external business rivals, but by someone within his own company who stood to profit from his removal before the Riverside vote. Caroline's voice remained steady despite the implications of her discovery. "There's more, Richard. The geological surveys that were summarized for the board, they omitted critical findings. Riverside sits on land with rare mineral deposits that become accessible during deep foundation excavation. The environmental impact report classified them as incidental discoveries to avoid triggering additional regulations, but their estimated value exceeds $3 billion. Hayes stared at the evidence pieces falling into place with sickening clarity. This wasn't simply about luxury condominiums. It was about extracting resources from beneath a community that had never been informed of their existence. Meanwhile, Keisha and Zuri had returned to their apartment in Riverside. Against Hayes's urgent advice, Keisha's determination to stand with her community, overriding concerns about potential threats. The vandalism had sparked a neighborhood response, with residents organizing rotating watches to ensure the Williams family's safety. Keisha channeled her conflicted feelings about Hayes into action-gathering neighbors in the community center to research Riverside's history. Elderly residents shared oral histories passed through generations, while younger volunteers searched county archives and historical society records. Their collective efforts uncovered deeds and documents proving the neighborhood had been established by freed slaves who purchased the land communally in 1867. Subsequent decades had seen systematic attempts to undermine their ownership through discriminatory lending practices, zoning changes, and infrastructure decisions designed to devalue the area. The historical documentation provided potential legal leverage against the development through historical preservation claims that could force significant modifications to any construction plans. The process of uncovering this history united residents across generational lines, creating renewed determination to preserve not just buildings, but the community's soul. While Keisha immersed herself in organizing this resistance, Hayes faced his own internal conflict. During his weekly visit to Silvercrest Nursing Home, his mother Eleanor experienced one of her increasingly rare moments of clarity amidst advancing dementia. Eleanor Hayes had raised her son alone after his father abandoned them, working multiple cleaning jobs to keep them housed and fed her once sharp mind, now fading into confusion. On this particular Tuesday, however, she recognized her son immediately, her eyes focusing with unexpected lucidity. "Richie," she said, using his childhood nickname, "you look troubled." Hayes took his mother's fragile hand. The gulf between her modest room in a mid-tier nursing facility and his penthouse apartment, a testament to his complex relationship with his past. Despite his billions, Eleanor had refused more luxurious accommodations, insisting she was comfortable with people like her. He found himself confessing his conflict about Riverside, describing Zuri and Keisha in detail that surprised him with its emotional resonance. Eleanor listened with the same patient attention she had given his childhood troubles her response, when he finished both simple and devastating in its accuracy. "The boy who threw baseballs against our trailer all those years dreaming of making things fair someday. What would he think of the man you've become?" The question lingered uncomfortably as Hayes left the facility, forcing him to confront how thoroughly he had abandoned his early ideals in pursuit of wealth and influence. The uncomfortable self-examination continued as Hayes attended the regional youth baseball tournament where Zuri had qualified to compete against players 2 and 3 years older than herself. Her remarkable skill had earned her this opportunity, but the tournament atmosphere quickly revealed obstacles beyond athletic competition. Hayes watched from the bleachers as officials huddled with coaches from opposing teams, their expressions making their discomfort clear as they glanced repeatedly toward Zuri, warming up in her worn cleats and hand-me-down uniform. The tournament director eventually approached Keisha with a clipboard of hastily revised regulations. "There's been some concern about age-appropriate divisions," the director explained, avoiding direct eye contact. "We've created a separate exhibition division for urban youth development programs that might be more suitable for your daughter." The racial implications hung transparently in the air, though carefully couched in bureaucratic language. Keisha's spine straightened, her voice calm but resolute as she responded. "My daughter qualified under the existing rules. Unless you're prepared to disqualify her based explicitly on her race or gender, she'll be competing as registered." The confrontation escalated until Hayes found himself intervening his corporate influence, creating an uncomfortable deference from officials who had been dismissive moments earlier. The experience forced him to witness firsthand the systematic barriers Zuri faced, barriers invisible to him throughout his life of privilege, but insurmountable without intervention regardless of her extraordinary talent. The tournament proceeded with Zuri allowed to compete, though under clearly hostile conditions from officials who scrutinized her performance for any technicality that might disqualify her. Despite this pressure, she advanced through preliminary rounds, her precision throwing, drawing reluctant admiration even from opponents. Between games, Hayes received an anonymous text message containing photos of himself with the Williams family at the tournament, followed by images of the interior of Keisha's apartment. The accompanying message made Huntington's connection to Reynolds explicitly clear. "Original development plans proceed unchanged, or your board hears about your security failure, and the Williams family has an unfortunate accident. Business is business." The threat crystallized Hayes's decision point. His corporate empire, built over 20 years, balanced against his rediscovered humanity and the safety of a child who had saved his life. As Zuri stepped onto the field for the tournament semifinals, her confident stance belying the pressure surrounding her, Hayes made the first of many choices that would reshape his understanding of wealth, power, and responsibility in ways he could not yet fully comprehend. Richard Hayes sat across from Caroline Chen in a 24-hour diner 30 miles outside the city, the location chosen specifically because neither of them would normally frequent such an establishment. The laminated menu and slightly sticky table created a surreal backdrop for their hushed conversation about corporate conspiracy and potential crimes. Hayes pushed aside his untouched coffee as Caroline placed her encrypted laptop between them, her voice barely above a whisper despite the relative privacy. "I've traced the financial connections between Huntington and Reynolds back 3 years. They've used similar arrangements in at least 5 other development projects across the country." The screen displayed complex diagrams of shell companies and offshore accounts. But Riverside is different. The mineral deposits make it exponentially more valuable, especially with the Department of Defense contracts that depend on these specific rare earth elements. Hayes studied the evidence, his expression hardening as Caroline continued. The environmental impact statements were systematically falsified. If these minerals are extracted according to the current development plan, the groundwater contamination would affect Riverside and surrounding areas for decades. She hesitated before adding predominantly Black and Hispanic neighborhoods, all conveniently scheduled for revitalization after the damage is done. The revelation struck Hayes with physical force, making him recognize his unwitting role in a scheme far more insidious than luxury condominiums displacing a historic community. His company, the technology innovator he had built from nothing, the corporate entity he had considered his life's achievement, had become a vehicle for environmental racism and exploitation in ways he had never examined closely, enough to understand. The evidence was damning enough to warrant federal investigation, but going public would likely tank Nexus's stock value overnight, potentially destroying thousands of jobs throughout their corporate ecosystem. "We need to move carefully," Hayes cautioned, weighing competing responsibilities. Gather everything into secured files, but don't transmit anything electronically. We need physical backups stored somewhere neither Huntington nor Reynolds would think to look. The conversation shifted to immediate protective measures for the Williams family, with Hayes insisting on enhanced but unobtrusive security while they developed their strategy. Back in Riverside, the community faced escalating tension as eviction notices arrived at dozens of homes despite the postponed council vote and ongoing legal challenges. Residents gathered at Macedonia Baptist Church, their anger and fear palpable as community leaders attempted to coordinate responses. Keisha Williams had emerged as an unexpected organizational force, her medical training providing systematic clarity to the chaotic emotional landscape. Her growing prominence came with consequences, however, as hospital administrators called her into an uncomfortable meeting where they expressed concerns about her extracurricular activities, creating conflicts of interest. The hospital board, they explained without stating directly, included several members with financial connections to Hayes's business associates. While they couldn't legally terminate her employment for community activism, they could reassign her to less desirable shifts and reduce her hours just enough to create financial strain without triggering discrimination claims. Zuri faced her own increasing challenges at school, where administrators suddenly found rule violations in her behavior that had previously been overlooked. When a white student shoved her in the hallway, calling her a charity case in reference to her baseball coaching, both children received identical disciplinary actions, despite security footage clearly showing Zuri had not retaliated. The administrator dismissed Keisha's protests about the unfair treatment with a practice speech about zero-tolerance policies that somehow always seemed to tolerate certain behaviors from certain children while punishing others disproportionately. The community's collective stress reached breaking point when suspicious fire broke out at the Riverside Community Center, specifically damaging the room where historical documents had been gathered as evidence for preservation claims. The arson investigation proceeded with suspicious lack of urgency, the fire officially classified as of undetermined origin, despite multiple witnesses reporting unusual activity around the building before flames appeared. The community immediately placed responsibility at the feet of Nexus Innovations, their anger finally boiling over into protests outside the corporate headquarters downtown. Hayes attempted to address the protesters directly, stepping outside the gleaming glass building without security personnel against Caroline's urgent advice. The crowd's hostility was immediate and overwhelming, years of justified mistrust erupting as someone threw a half-full soda can that struck Hayes's temple, the liquid splashing across his suit as security personnel rushed to extract him from the increasingly volatile situation. The minor injury required 3 stitches, but triggered vivid flashbacks to the night in Pinecrest Alley when Zuri had saved him from far worse harm. As medical staff attended to his wound, Hayes received the call that would shatter whatever remaining illusions he held about the boundaries of Huntington's ruthlessness. Zuri Williams had disappeared from her school playground during afternoon recess, with security footage showing men matching the description of his original attackers, escorting her into an unmarked van. The school had inexplicably waited 40 minutes before contacting Keisha, precious time lost in the critical window, for recovering abducted children. Hayes rushed to Riverside, finding Keisha in a state of controlled terror at the local police precinct, where officers took statements with bureaucratic slowness that suggested low priority despite the circumstances. Their eyes met across the room, mutual suspicion momentarily suspended by shared desperation for Zuri's safety. Before either could speak, Hayes's phone chimed with a message containing a video of Zuri unharmed, but clearly frightened, holding a newspaper with the current date. The accompanying text outlined non-negotiable terms: withdraw all opposition to the original development plan, destroy all evidence against Huntington, and ensure the council vote proceeded as originally scheduled within 48 hours. Keisha watched Hayes's expression as he viewed the message, her medical training, allowing her to read micro-expressions that revealed both his responsibility and his genuine anguish. "They took my daughter because of you," she stated, her voice remarkably steady despite the accusation. Hayes did not attempt to deny the connection, instead showing her the message with its impossible demands. Yes, and I'm the only one who can help get her back. The admission created a fragile alliance forged in crisis. Two people from worlds designed to remain separate, forced to trust each other completely, despite every societal force telling them not to. The shared terror for Zuri's safety temporarily bridged gaps of race, class, and history that had previously seemed insurmountable. Are you feeling the tension building in this story? Comment number 1 if you believe Hayes should risk everything to save Zuri, or comment number 2 if you think he should prioritize exposing the larger conspiracy that threatens the entire community. Like this video, if you're captivated by how unexpected connections can form during crisis moments, and subscribe to see how this high-stakes situation unfolds. Will Keisha and Hayes overcome their fundamental differences to work together? What sacrifices will each make to rescue Zuri? And what powerful forces will they unleash by challenging the status quo? The next part of this story will reveal just how far Hayes is willing to go as he enters Reynolds' territory alone, seemingly ready to surrender everything he's built. But is this apparent capitulation exactly what it seems? Richard Hayes strode into the upscale steakhouse where James Huntington waited in a private dining room, the billionaire's normally impeccable appearance showing subtle signs of strain, his tie slightly askew, dark circles beneath his paroties, eyes betraying sleepless nights. Huntington rose with practiced cordiality, gesturing to the vintage bourbon already poured into crystal glasses. "Richard, I'm pleased you've come to your senses." These community entanglements were becoming quite the distraction from our core business objectives. Hayes took the offered seat, but left the bourbon untouched, sliding a folder across the polished mahogany table. The signed agreements transferring controlling interest in Nexus to your consortium, my resignation as CEO, effective immediately, and formal withdrawal of all modified plans for Riverside development. His voice remained steady, betraying none of the strategic calculations behind this apparent capitulation. I've also included personal statements to the press, citing health concerns as my reason for stepping down. Huntington's satisfied smile didn't reach his eyes as he scanned the documents looking for hidden clauses or legal traps. Finding none, he signaled to Victor Reynolds, who had been watching silently from a corner of the room. "Ensure our young baseball prodigy is returned unharmed once these documents are verified and filed." What Huntington couldn't see was Caroline Chen, several blocks away, coordinating with Keisha Williams, as they triangulated cell phone signals and tracked the location of Zuri's baseball, which contained a tiny transmitter Hayes had installed weeks earlier as a precautionary measure. His security team's suggestion, after the initial attack in the alley, had made the child a potential target. The apparent surrender was a carefully orchestrated diversion, buying time for a rescue operation already in motion. Zuri Williams sat cross-legged on a dusty mattress in an abandoned apartment within the Lakeside Industrial Complex, a collection of buildings scheduled for demolition once Huntington's development plans expanded beyond. Riverside. Unlike the frightened child her captors expected, Zuri had been methodically observing and analyzing her surroundings with remarkable composure for someone so young. She noted guard rotations, overheard conversations about security systems, and most importantly, recognized the baseball logo on one guard's cap, the Eastside Raptors, a team her father had followed devotedly before his imprisonment. This small detail became the foundation of connection as she engaged the guard in casual conversation about recent games, gradually establishing herself as a child rather than merely a bargaining chip. While creating this humanizing connection, Zuri systematically left subtle clues throughout the building when allowed bathroom breaks. Baseball-related markings that would seem like childish scribbles to most observers, but would instantly communicate specific locations to Hayes, who now shared her knowledge of baseball history and terminology. These breadcrumbs proved invaluable when the rescue team's communication devices malfunctioned due to signal jammers installed throughout the industrial complex. The rescue coalition itself represented perhaps the most unexpected development in the unfolding drama. Riverside residents who had days earlier protested against Hayes now volunteered to help save Zuri, prioritizing a child's safety. above their justified anger toward the billionaire. Mrs. Jenkins emerged as a crucial strategist, revealing that her late husband Marcus had been a decorated police detective whose extensive files on building layouts in the industrial district remained in her possession. Marcus always said the official city plans were missing key access points, she explained, spreading yellowed blueprints across Caroline's desk. Service tunnels from the original factory complex were never properly documented during later renovations. Her arthritis-gnarled fingers traced potential entry routes with the precision of someone who had absorbed decades of law enforcement strategy through marital osmosis. The rescue planning faced a critical complication when Keisha's contacts within the police department revealed evidence of information leaks. Someone with access to official channels was feeding updates to Huntington's team, compromising any attempt to involve larger law enforcement resources. This forced Hayes and Keisha into the agonizing decision to proceed with a smaller rescue team rather than wait for official backup that might never arrive, or worse, alert the kidnappers to their approach. Their makeshift team included Caroline's unexpected expertise in security systems, Keisha's medical knowledge, Hayes's technological resources, and the irreplaceable community knowledge provided by longtime Riverside residents who understood the industrial area's actual layout rather than its official documentation. As they prepared to move, Hayes pulled Keisha aside, his typical corporate confidence replaced by raw honesty. "I need you to know something before we go in there. If this goes wrong somehow, there are secured files with Caroline containing everything: the mineral deposits, the environmental fraud, Huntington's connections to Reynolds. I've established a trust that will fund both legal challenges to the development and Zuri's education through graduate school, regardless of what happens tonight." Keisha studied his face, searching for the calculated self-interest she had expected from him since their first encounter. Finding instead genuine concern and responsibility, she nodded once, a momentary acknowledgement of his evolution, without offering the absolution he hadn't directly requested. The rescue operation proceeded through the maintenance tunnels Mrs. Jenkins had identified the team navigating by emergency lighting and the hand-drawn additions her husband had made to official blueprints decades earlier. They encountered their first armed guard at a junction point, Hayes moving forward alone to create a distraction, while Keisha and Caroline circled to the primary holding area where Zuri's transmitter signal originated. Hayes found himself face-to-face with Reynolds, the man who had orchestrated the original alley attack and now held a child hostage for corporate gain. Without his wealth security team or corporate power to shield him, Hayes relied solely on his wits and a newfound courage born from genuine purpose rather than profit motive. "It was never about the development for you, was it?" Hayes asked, maintaining eye contact with Reynolds while subtly positioning himself to block visibility of the corridor behind him. "Huntington offered you something more personal." Reynolds circled Hayes cautiously, his expression revealing surprise at confronting the billionaire alone in this deteriorating industrial setting. "He made it worth my while financially, certainly. But you're right, there's satisfaction beyond money in watching you lose everything." His voice hardened as he continued. 3 years ago, your East River development displaced 600 families, including mine. My mother died in transitional housing, waiting for the affordable units your PR team promised but never delivered. Just another casualty of progress that never made your quarterly reports. The revelation landed like a physical blow, forcing Hayes to confront the human cost of past development projects he had approved, with casual signatures on documents that never detailed the lives upended. The cycle of harm his business practices had perpetuated had created the very person now threatening an innocent child, a symmetry too perfect to be coincidental and too painful to dismiss. Their confrontation provided the necessary distraction for Keisha to reach Zuri following the baseball-themed markings her daughter had cleverly left throughout the building. The reunion between mother and child was necessarily brief and silent, their escape route requiring immediate movement before the guard rotation discovered the deception. Caroline's expertise with security systems created a cascading series of false alarms throughout the complex, disorienting the security team as the rescue party extracted through the maintenance tunnels. Hayes remained behind to ensure their escape. His final confrontation with Reynolds, ending not in violence but in an unexpected moment of shared recognition. Two men from poverty who had chosen radically different paths in response to systems designed to keep them separated by class, if not by race. "This won't end here," Reynolds warned as Hayes backed toward his own escape route. "Huntington has contingencies you haven't considered." Hayes nodded grimly. "I'm counting on it." The evidence doesn't just implicate him. It exposes an entire system. Sometimes you need to lose everything to see what actually matters. As police sirens wailed in the distance, summoned by automated protocols Caroline had triggered rather than direct calls to compromised departments, Hayes slipped into the maintenance tunnel, emerging blocks away where Keisha waited with Zuri in a nondescript sedan rather than the luxury vehicles he typically commanded. The child's safety had been secured, but the larger battle for Riverside's future and the exposure of corporate corruption had only begun. The night's events had transformed theoretical alliances into battle-tested trust, creating bonds between unlikely collaborators that would prove essential in the challenges still to come. 3 days after Zuri's rescue, Richard Hayes lay in Mercy Hospital's private wing medical monitors, tracking his vital signs as doctors treated 2 cracked ribs and a concussion sustained during a confrontation with Reynolds' security team during their escape. The stark hospital room, with its institutional lighting and antiseptic smell, offered none of the luxury the billionaire typically surrounded himself with, yet Hayes found an unexpected clarity in these stripped-down surroundings. Outside his door, 2 private security professionals vetted all visitors, not Nexus employees but independent contractors. Caroline had engaged through her personal networks, people with no connection to Huntington's sphere of influence. National news outlets covered the kidnapping and rescue with breathless sensationalism, initial reporting framing Hayes as either a heroic figure who had risked his life to save a child or a calculating businessman orchestrating an elaborate public relations stunt to salvage his reputation and development plans. The truth, as always, contained elements of both narratives while transcending their simplistic frameworks. Huntington had moved swiftly to activate damage control protocols, corporate attorneys issuing carefully worded statements distancing Nexus Innovations from the unauthorized actions of a former employee acting without board approval. The documents Hayes had signed in the steakhouse remained unprocessed, Huntington apparently recognizing the potential trap they represented once Reynolds had been taken into police custody. Financial markets responded with predictable volatility to the uncertainty surrounding one of the technology sector's bellwether companies. Nexus stock dropping 17% in 2 days of trading as institutional investors sought to minimize exposure to potential scandal. For Keisha Williams, the emotional aftermath proved as challenging as the ordeal itself. Zuri's physical injuries were minimal, but the psychological impact revealed itself in nightmares and a new wariness that pained her mother to witness in a child previously defined by confidence and openness. More complicated was Zuri's insistence on visiting Hayes during his recovery, bringing her baseball to practice throwing in the hospital corridor, while waiting for nurses to allow brief visits. Hospital administrators initially attempted to enforce visiting restrictions until witnessing the remarkable improvement in Hayes's vital signs following Zuri's first appearance at his bedside. The child approached medical settings with the familiarity of someone raised by a healthcare professional, unintimidated by equipment that adults often found anxiety-inducing. "You should use your legs more when you throw," she informed Hayes seriously during one visit, demonstrating proper form despite the limited space. "Coach Jefferson says power comes from the ground up." Hayes nodded with equal seriousness, accepting instruction from his 6-year-old mentor, with the same attention he would give a corporate board presentation. Keisha observed these interactions with conflicted emotions, recognizing the genuine connection forming between her daughter and Hayes, while remaining acutely aware of the vast power differential that still existed despite recent events. The media attention surrounding Zuri's kidnapping created unexpected consequences for Riverside's future, as corporate opportunists descended on the neighborhood with alternative development proposals. Without Hayes's resources or Huntington's political connections, residents found themselves with potentially less leverage in upcoming city council deliberations. Venture capitalists specializing in distressed properties began approaching individual homeowners with lowball offers, attempting to acquire properties piecemeal when the unified development approach appeared compromised. These predatory practices targeted elderly residents, particularly offering immediate cash payments that seemed substantial until compared with actual property values in a gentrifying market. Keisha discovered previously untapped leadership abilities as she organized community response, establishing information sessions to help neighbors understand their legal rights and the true value of their properties. Her medical training provided an unexpected foundation for community organizing. The ability to communicate complex information, clearly remain calm during crises, and prioritize immediate needs while maintaining focus on long-term health. Evening meetings at Macedonia Baptist Church transformed from venues of anxious speculation to strategic planning sessions, with residents developing expertise in zoning regulations, historical preservation statutes, and community land trust, models that might protect their neighborhood from the next wave of developers already circling. Hayes observed this community mobilization from his hospital bed through updates from Caroline and his own monitoring of local news coverage. His corporate perspective had always viewed community opposition as an obstacle to overcome rather than a legitimate expression of self-determination. Witnessing Riverside residents' sophisticated response to predatory tactics forced him to recognize the intelligence, adaptability, and commitment he had previously dismissed when calculating cost-benefit analyses of development resistance. This recognition catalyzed a fundamental shift in his understanding of wealth and community, prompting late-night conversations with Caroline about restructuring Nexus ownership to include a community development trust. The traditional corporate model extracts value from communities and concentrates it among shareholders who have no connection to the places being developed. He explained, sketching organizational charts on his hospital whiteboard. What if we inverted that relationship? What if residents became shareholders in development within their own communities? Caroline listened with both enthusiasm and practical concerns, particularly about shareholder reactions. The board will fight this every step of the way. Winters and Thompson have already reached out about forming a coalition to force your complete removal rather than the temporary medical leave we announced. Hayes nodded, unsurprised. Let them try. I still control enough voting shares to make this change if we structure it correctly, but we'll need to move quickly before Huntington consolidates opposition. As Hayes recovered sufficiently for discharge against medical advice, the rescheduled city council vote on Riverside's future loomed. The council chambers overflowed beyond capacity, with proceedings broadcast to screens in adjacent rooms and live-streamed to community centers throughout affected neighborhoods. Council members shifted uncomfortably on the dais as competing interests lobbied intensely in the days leading up to this decisive meeting. Hayes arrived in a wheelchair, his physical vulnerability, a visual representation of how recent events had transformed his relationship to power and privilege. When recognized to speak, he navigated to the central podium, the room falling silent, as he prepared to address the council and assembled community. His testimony outlined a revolutionary approach to urban development that prioritized resident ownership, historical preservation, and environmental remediation. Rather than positioning these elements as concessions to community pressure, Hayes presented them as fundamental business principles for sustainable development in the 21st century. The extractive development model has failed not just morally but economically, he stated, presenting data from previous projects where community displacement had created hidden costs never captured in corporate balance sheets. We have the opportunity to pioneer a new approach that generates more sustainable returns by investing in people and places rather than simply extracting value from them. The council's skepticism remained visible until Keisha Williams approached the podium, her testimony providing the essential community perspective that complemented Hayes's business analysis. Her presentation included health impact data from similar developments nationwide, connecting economic displacement directly to measurable public health outcomes that ultimately created costs absorbed by municipal systems rather than development corporations. Gentrification doesn't eliminate poverty, she noted, displaying comparative neighborhood statistics. It simply relocates it while destroying social support networks that help communities weather economic challenges. The complementary testimonies created powerful counterweight to remaining corporate interests still advocating for the original development plan. When deliberations appeared deadlocked between competing financial interests, Zuri approached the public comment microphone, creating the scene from the opening hook, a 6-year-old standing alone before the collective power of government and corporate interests, her small shoulders straight despite the whispers that rippled through the chamber. "I used to think grown-ups always knew what was right," she began, her voice clear, despite her nervousness. "But sometimes they forget to look at what's really important. My neighborhood isn't just buildings, it's Mrs. Jenkins, who watches me after school and tells stories about when Martin Luther King visited our church. It's Mr. Washington, who lets me practice baseball when the bigger kids take over the playground. It's the mural of my great-grandfather, who was one of the first black doctors in this city." She paused, making eye contact with council members, who suddenly found themselves confronted not by abstract policy, but by the human reality of their decisions. "Mr. Hayes forgot that too, until he got hurt in our alley, and I helped him. Now he remembers that people matter more than money. I hope you remember too." The chamber remained silent as she returned to her seat, her simple testimony, cutting through hours of technical and legal arguments to the essential moral question at the heart of development politics: who bears the cost of progress and cost, who receives its benefits. 1 year after the tumultuous city council vote that had fundamentally altered Riverside's trajectory, the neighborhood buzzed with activity that represented neither the wholesale gentrification originally planned nor the preservation of an unsustainable status quo. Instead, targeted revitalization projects preserved the community's historical structures while adding essential services long denied through systematic disinvestment. The centerpiece of this transformation was the Marcus Jenkins Memorial Sports Complex, its state-of-the-art baseball diamond currently occupied by Zuri Williams and 5 younger children she coached with surprising patience. For a 7-year-old, "Keep your eye on the ball all the way to the bat," she instructed a nervous 5-year-old, attempting his first hit, her teaching style mimicking Coach Jefferson's encouraging approach rather than the harsh criticism often directed at young athletes. "Remember, baseball is supposed to be fun even when it's hard." From the bleachers, Richard Hayes watched the impromptu coaching session with undisguised pride, his expensive suit replaced by casual attire that would have been unimaginable in his former corporate persona. The past year had aged him, visibly silver-threading more prominently. Through his dark hair, new lines etched around his eyes from battles fought across boardrooms, courtrooms, and legislative chambers. His resignation as CEO of Nexus Innovations had shocked the business world, with financial publications questioning his sanity, while social justice organizations maintained skeptical distance, uncertain whether his conversion represented genuine evolution or calculated reinvention. The truth, as Hayes had discovered, was that transformation rarely follows neat narratives of redemption or cynical strategic positioning. His current role as chairperson of the Riverside Community Development Corporation represented neither complete absolution for past harms nor perfect alignment with community perspectives, but rather an ongoing process of reconciliation through action rather than rhetoric. The corporation's revolutionary business model gave residents ownership stakes in local development, ensuring that economic growth benefited existing community members rather than displacing them for newcomers. Keisha Williams had initially declined Hayes's offer to lead the corporation's health initiatives, suspicious of potential tokenism, but eventually accepted the position after helping design its structure and mission. Her expertise had proven invaluable in creating innovative programs addressing racial disparities in medical care, including a community health worker program that trained local residents as healthcare navigators and preventive care specialists. The partnership between the former nurse and the former billionaire remained complex, defined by mutual respect that acknowledged their fundamentally different experiences while finding productive common ground in specific goals. Huntington and Reynolds faced justice through federal investigations, triggered by the evidence Hayes and Caroline had methodically compiled, though the process revealed disturbing patterns extending far beyond one development project or one neighborhood. Similar arrangements between corporate developers, corrupt officials, and enforcement thugs emerged in cities nationwide, suggesting systemic rather than isolated corruption. Hayes dedicated substantial resources to supporting communities facing similar struggles, earning powerful enemies within his former business circles while finding unexpected allies among ethical investors seeking sustainable development models. His wealth had diminished significantly through both legal battles and voluntary redistribution, though he remained far more financially comfortable than most Americans could imagine. The transformation in his relationship to money proved more significant than its reduction. Wealth had become a tool for specific purposes rather than a scorecard of personal worth or achievement. Zuri's journey paralleled these larger changes her exceptional baseball talent, securing a scholarship to the prestigious Wellington Academy, which had previously accepted no female students throughout its 87-year history. Her presence challenged institutional norms beyond gender, as the predominantly white wealthy student body rarely encountered peers from neighborhoods like Riverside. When faced with discrimination both subtle and overt, Zuri demonstrated remarkable resilience, applying lessons learned from both Keisha's principled persistence and Hayes's strategic approach to systemic obstacles. Rather than internalizing exclusion, she systematically documented disparities in resources and opportunities, eventually presenting administration officials with compelling evidence that forced institutional reflection and policy changes. The story's conclusion mirrored its beginning in unexpected ways, with Hayes facing former business associates threatening his new ventures during congressional testimony on discriminatory development practices nationwide. The corporate power brokers, who had once welcomed him into exclusive circles, now viewed him as a dangerous traitor, exposing industry practices long hidden from public scrutiny. Where Hayes might once have stood alone in such confrontations, relying solely on individual wealth and influence, he now found strength in collective support as community members from Riverside and similar neighborhoods across the country filled the hearing room, their presence demonstrating that his testimony represented lived experiences rather than abstract principles. After the hearing concluded, Hayes joined Zuri at a nearby park where she had insisted on continuing their regular practice session despite the day's momentous events. "Your follow-through is still inconsistent," she informed him, critically analyzing his throwing motion with the seriousness of a professional coach. "You're thinking too much about where the ball might go, instead of trusting your body to know." Hayes laughed with genuine pleasure at receiving expert instruction. From a 7-year-old, the sound representing how far he had traveled from the tightly controlled corporate executive who had walked alone into Pinecrest Alley year earlier. Their continued relationship represented something neither could have anticipated: how genuine connection across differences of race, class, age, and experience might create not just individual transformation, but systemic change. The baseball arced between them in continuous exchange, symbolizing how each continued to rescue the other in different ways, breaking cycles of both personal and systemic discrimination through their unlikely alliance. What began as a singular act of courage when a young girl saved a stranger in an alley had expanded into a community reclaiming its power, a businessman rediscovering his humanity, and perhaps most importantly, a child recognizing her own capacity to change systems that adults had accepted as immutable. What would you do if you witnessed someone in danger? Would you risk your safety to help them, even if they seem different from you? Comment below with your thoughts on how unexpected connections can transform communities. If this story about courage, justice, and finding common ground across differences moved you, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to hear that positive change is possible, even in the most divided times. Thank you for joining us for this incredible journey from a dangerous alley to new foundations for an entire community. Remember that sometimes the most powerful stories begin with the smallest, bravest actions. This story reveals powerful truths about connection and transformation across seemingly insurmountable divides. It teaches us that genuine change requires both personal awakening and systemic reconstruction. When Hayes confronts how his business practices hurt communities like Riverside, we see how privilege can blind us to the human cost of our actions. Zuri's courage demonstrates that even the most vulnerable among us possess extraordinary power to change lives and challenge broken systems. The transformation of their relationship, from a chance encounter to a partnership that reshapes an entire community, reminds us that meaningful alliances can form in unexpected places when we recognize our shared humanity. The story also illuminates how racism and economic exploitation often intertwine, creating systems that appear inevitable until challenged by unlikely coalitions. Mrs. Jenkins, Keisha, and other Riverside residents show us that communities hold wisdom, resilience, and solutions that outsiders often fail to recognize. Their collective action proves more powerful than any individual, even a billionaire. Perhaps most importantly, the narrative reminds us that redemption isn't about perfect transformation, but ongoing commitment to repair harm and create more just systems. True change happens not through grand gestures, but through continuous small actions that gradually rebuild what was broken. Has someone from a completely different background ever changed your perspective on something important? We'd love to hear about unexpected connections that transformed your understanding of community privilege or justice. Comment below with your story. If you believe that bridging divides across race and class is essential for creating a more just world, hit that like button to spread this message. Do you know someone who's working to make their community stronger in the face of discrimination or gentrification? Share this video with them as encouragement that positive change is possible. Subscribe for more powerful stories that challenge us to look beyond stereotypes and recognize our shared humanity. Thank you for joining us on this journey of courage, transformation, and hope. Remember that sometimes the smallest act of bravery can start a movement that changes everything.